Hello, everybody. Mahadeva, the Thunder Wizard. Today we're going to be reading from my book, Shamanism for, quote, white people, unquote. Again, just let me say right from the beginning, I put the word white in quotes because this is not about race. This is actually about unifying everybody, regardless of race. We are all the same family. We all come from the same earth. We all worship the same gods. We have different names for them, but we're all the human race. So let's just get over that. Let's just go ahead and be that. But I do want to help people, each individual, find their own path that works best for them. My path might not be the path that works best for you. So I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts about some misunderstandings that we might have about shamanism and spirituality in general. And I am certain to piss everybody off. But as I said in the beginning of the first part, I want to make it clear. I will not tolerate any kind of exclusionism, racialism, or racism on my channel. And if that's what you're looking for, you have found the wrong place. Because, I consider this to be as much my heritage as anything else. You can see that's me on the left there. And that's my teacher, Baba Ayo, Yoruba drum master and priest. Okay, but we won't take time to watch that right now. If you guys want, we can watch that later. All right, so before we go any further, before I get into the reading of the book, we have the 90-day challenge. So go to thunderwizard.com, which is my subscription site, and look for the Warrior 90-day challenge subscription option. And there you can practice with me. Not just have me talk to you about spirituality or talk to you about doing things. I actually practice what I do with you, doing the exercises, doing the meditations. You get to do them with me. And these are things that I do in order to align myself to my soul. You know, there's really only one thing to do here on this planet. There's only one thing. And that is to connect to your soul and live from your soul. Everything that happens in your life is either a result of you doing that correctly, or the challenges that come up as a result of karmic issues or lessons that your soul chooses to learn, which are again about trying to get you to learn how to operate from your soul. Your soul wants to experience itself. The soul is infinite. And when the soul is not incarnated in a human body, it is infinite. It is infinite in bliss. It is infinite in power. It is infinite in knowledge, in experience. It is everywhere. It is God. Your soul is God. And in order for your soul to really experience itself, it wants to be limited into a three-dimensional form. And this, your physical body, is the avatar. It's just like a video game. You know, you have to have an avatar that you can run around with and do things and slash enemies and, all the stuff that, that's what makes video games fun. And the whole point of this video game here is for you to get to the end goal, which is come back to your soul. And the way that you do that is you listen to your joy. And one of the biggest challenges, the biggest challenge, and I'm not minimizing it, is we also become programmed by other people's agendas, by the agendas of society. I went on and on about racism. Racism is another agenda that people try and program you with so that you will be diverted from your soul. So the whole point is to live from your soul. And everything that we encounter is the obstacles of the game. But if you forget what the point of the game is, you don't remember what the point of the game is, then it won't matter. But the point of the game is to live directly from your soul. All right, so we're going to read from the book. This is part 2. I see 2 people have said hello. Vincent says hello. And Yanka, hi Yanka. Yanka says hello. All right, we're going to go ahead and read from the book. This is from my book, Shamanism for, quote, white people, unquote. And I'm going to be starting from page 30. Whoops, hit the wrong program. Hang on. You don't want that. I want this. All right, so starting from page 30. Siberian Tangerism versus Neo-Shamanism. So before I get any further into pre-Christian European spiritual heritage, let us first examine some of the inaccurate information regarding the word shamanism. It is important to be educated about this word because it has been inaccurately used for centuries. First, we need to understand that in actuality, there is no such word as shamanism. A shaman is an animist priest exclusive to the indigenous Siberian religion, which is called Tangerism. The appropriate term for the authentic Siberian animism is Tangerism, not shamanism. The word shaman means priest. So to try and make it would be like creating a religion called priestism. Doesn't really make any sense. The priest is, just the person that acts as the intermediary in that particular religion or path. All right. Secondly, according to Tangerism, no one can arbitrarily choose to become a shaman. The individual must be chosen by the ancestor spirits, and then he or she must train with a recognized master shaman. That means that even native Siberians cannot call themselves a shaman until having been initiated and recognized as such by a master. The reason the word shaman has come to refer to an animist priest in modern Western society is because this word was appropriated in the 17th century by Europeans, Christians, who visited Siberia. So before we go any further, I'm throwing around the word animism. So in the first part of the book, we talked about what animism means. So animism is actually the correct word if you want to talk about shamanism, because animism means that is the belief that everything in the universe has a soul, that everything in the universe can be communicated with. Even my chapstick here. This it just jumped out of my hand. This can be communicated with. Ideas, you can communicate with ideas. You can communicate with trees, plants, rocks, animals. Drums, if you have a drum and you play a drum, you can talk to your drum and communicate with your drum. In fact, my teacher, the guy I just showed you, lots of times people in class would sit back in their chair and they would put their feet up on the drum, and he would say, "What are you doing? Why are you putting your feet on your grandfather's head?" He wouldn't do that. Or people would sit with their elbows on the drum, and he would say, "Why are you putting your elbows on your grandfather's head?" So this is what shamanism is really trying to mean. So when people use the word shamanism, they really mean animism. But technically speaking, shamanism doesn't exist, and shaman just means priest in the Tangerist religion. All right, so as I said, the word, let's go back here. So secondly, the reason the word shaman has come to refer to an animist priest in modern Western society is because this word was appropriated in the 17th century by Europeans, Christian Europeans who visited Siberia. These European Christians witnessed indigenous Tangerist priests practicing their religion. Since by that point in time, in the 1600s, Europeans had no cultural memory of the similar animist practices of their own ancestors just a few centuries earlier. These Christians perceived the animist practices of the Tangerist priests as being exotic, primitive, superstitious, and even evil. From this time on, European anthropologists began describing any indigenous animist practice as shamanism. So from the very beginning of the anthropological use of the term shamanism, it was associated with a generalized definition of every animist practice regardless of cultural origin. This is another reason why this term is so offensive to both Native Americans and Siberian Tangerists if used inaccurately. By arbitrarily calling something shamanism or shamanic, it dilutes both the Siberian religion and whatever practice it attempts to describe. Animism is an appropriate term for all the above practices because it is intended to be a generalized description. So I propose that when anyone wishes to use the term shamanism to describe an animist practice, that we instead replace it with the terms animist, animism, or animistic. By definition, Tangerism and many Native American practices can be accurately described as forms of animism. This way, Native Americans, Tangerists, and Westerners can find common ground to build upon and dialogue surrounding common animist understandings. We can acknowledge the shared similarities held by all animist practices without diluting them or demeaning any of them. Now, it has been probably 10 years since I wrote this book. I have since stopped trying to do that. As you can tell, I use the word shaman and shamanism all the time. And the reason I do is because if I walk around using the word animism, the average person isn't going to know what I'm talking about. If I say I'm an animist priest or the animist practices of my ancestors, people won't know what that means unless they're an anthropologist. So I still use the word shaman and shamanism just because that is the recognized word, and my job is to communicate to as many people as want to know this, so I use words that people understand. So I've gotten over that thing. But anyway, I'll keep reading. While I do not speak for any Native Americans, I have made some observations. What seems to me to be one of the main issues with Native Americans is not that Westerners are seeking to practice animism, but that they are appropriating the cultural symbols, language, and identities of Native American tribes without permission in an attempt to practice animism. It is my sense that most Native Americans would be happy to share general animist spiritual knowledge with fellow animists who are seeking to resurrect their own ancestral animist practices. Such shared knowledge might be incorporated into these resurrected European practices, animist practices, as long as we used our own symbolism. Any Native American wisdom keepers who wish to confirm or deny this impression that I have is encouraged to contact me. Nobody has yet. In fact, if this book finds its way into any authentic Native American spiritual practitioners and you'd like to work together with me in helping to educate people in this regard, you are invited to contact me. In my opinion, the perceived need of Westerners to appropriate foreign animism stems from a deep spiritual insecurity by Westerners whose ancestors themselves were victims of cultural and spiritual genocide at the hands of Roman imperialists and later Christian missionaries. So I did. I made that invitation that if any Native American practitioners wanted to reach out to me, they could. None have, and I've sort of given up on that whole feeling that I wanted to, sort of talk about it. So I don't really talk about it a whole heck of a lot anymore. But this was 10 years ago when I wrote this. The main point here is that we, all of us on the planet, regardless of our ethnic or cultural or linguistic background, regardless of our background, when you go back far enough in time, everybody's religion is basically operates on the same functional understanding of animism, which is that everything communicates to you. The earth communicates, the sky, the clouds, the trees, the rocks, the ancestors, the gods. Everything and everybody can be communicated with. All right, so let's continue. The Roman and Christian oppression of indigenous European animists. Many people may not realize it, but the same kind of ethnic, spiritual, and cultural genocide that has been visited upon Native American cultures and other indigenous cultures by Europeans over the past 500 years was also visited upon northern European animist tribes and cultures 2,000 years ago by Roman invaders and then later Christian missionaries. Let me share 3 examples. Bear in mind that these 3 instances are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the 2,000 years of oppression against animism in the Western world. The destruction of the Druids. In 43 AD, Rome invaded Celtic Britain. During the resulting occupation that lasted for 400 years, in case you need some context of that, the United States was the first Europeans that entered the continental United States was 400 years ago. So that gives you an idea of how long the Druids in Britain, how long the Romans occupied Celtic Britain. By the time that the Romans left, Druidism had been destroyed. It had been completely wiped out. All right, so in 43 AD, Rome invaded Celtic Britain. During the resulting occupation that lasted for 400 years, the Roman army completely wiped out the indigenous Druid population. Even though the Romans were a superior military force, the Druid priests held such powerful influence over the native Celtic tribes that even though they were outgunned, the native Celts believed that the power of the Druid priests would be able to drive out the Roman invaders. The Druids used their influence to continue to stir up rebellions among the native Celts. So to deal with this constant annoyance, the Roman army massacred all of the Druids. The Druids were literally driven over a cliff into the sea. Rome occupied Britain for 400 more years until the arrival of the Saxons. The Gothic War. In 376 AD, invading Huns from Siberia drove the Germanic Gothic tribes to the edge of the Roman territory. The Romans had, up until that time, been using Gothic warriors as mercenaries against each other. Rome had made and broken several treaties with them. Thousands of Goths had been taken into slavery. This had been going on for hundreds of years between Rome and the tribal Goths. But the Huns were now massacring the Goths and had driven them from their homeland. So the desperate Gothic tribes had no choice but to seek asylum in the safety of the Roman Empire. After being lawfully admitted into the Roman Empire and promised territory, food, and military protection from the invading Huns, the Germanic Gothic tribes were placed by Rome in concentration camps and denied food while their men were used as human shields in the Roman army. Gothic children were sold into slavery in exchange for dog meat. The Gothic tribes then desperately asked Rome for help and were told to endure a long march to the Roman city of Marcianople, where they were promised to be given food and supplies. After a long march that killed many of the sick and starving Goths, the Marcianople garrison refused them entry and then tried to assassinate Gothic leaders during a banquet in their honor. The Goths rebelled and defeated the Roman garrison at Marcianople. The Goths then went to other Roman towns seeking food and instead were greeted with Roman troops. In each instance, the hungry, desperate Goths defeated the Roman soldiers sent against them. Eventually, the Goths made their way to Rome itself, still seeking food. The Goths had successfully defeated the entire Western Roman military presence, and this left Rome defenseless. Rome still refused to give food to the Goths, so the Goths surrounded Rome. Months later, someone opened the gates. The Goths entered the city to find that there was no food or supplies left. Enraged, they sacked the city. The Goths had never intended on sacking Rome. All they wanted was a place to live and the means to make a living. With no homeland, no food, and no supplies, they had no choice but to rebel. Rome never recovered, all because they broke their word. This is the way our tribal ancestors were treated by the Roman Empire for hundreds of years. As with many conquered and oppressed cultures, the Romanized Germanic tribes adopted the ways of their oppressors. So I totally condensed that. I've made a video about all of that, but one of the things that I'd like to say, especially now, this is really, really important now because it has, and I'm grateful for it. In the States, the Black Lives Matter movement is not going away. It's there. You're not going to be able to, I was there during the Rodney King riots and all that, and it just kind of went away. It just faded away. Some changes were made and all that, but after a couple of months, people just sort of forgot about it, and things pretty much went back to the way they've always been. But it's not going away now, and I'm grateful for that. The reason why specifically Germanic people, the reason why the Anglo-Saxons, the Spaniards, by the way, are the descendants of those same Goths. The Goths that I talked to you about, who sacked Rome, who were treated like second-class citizens, who were put in giant concentration camps, who had to sell their children in exchange for dog meat in order to survive. Those people ended up becoming the Spaniards. So the Spanish people, they adopted the Roman language, and that's where Spanish came from. But those are the people who ended up coming over to the New World first and colonizing, Mexico and places like that. And then you have the other, northern Germanic tribes like the Anglo-Saxons, my ancestors. And the Anglo-Saxons, the same kind of thing. They had to go through all kinds of slavery and being treated, like garbage by the Romans for hundreds of years, taken into slavery, used as mercenaries, slaughtered, all that kind of stuff. And so when the Roman Empire fell, as a result of Rome simply not following through with its promises to these people who were looking for a place to live. Does it sound like kind of things that are going on now? As a result of that, they filled in the vacuum. So what ended up happening is that the Germanic tribes that ended up sacking Rome, they came in and they occupied Rome. And they, instead of like making, Italy and Rome a Germanic language speaking place like the English did in Britain, they just threw away all of their religion, their language, their culture, and they adopted Roman language and culture. But so it looks like there was this, continuous Roman presence, but in actuality, it completely flipped. And so what ended up happening is that Europeans, Northwestern Europeans specifically, have never dealt with the trauma of having been enslaved, having been massacred, having gone through genocide, having gone through all of the kinds of things that Europeans have done to the Native Americans, to here in Australia, what they've done to the indigenous people here. The reason why Europeans did that is because they're projecting onto everybody else their own internal mindset. And I don't know if this is ever going to stop until we can remember the trauma that we've been through, even though it's 2,000 years old, and we can acknowledge that we still carry around with us self-hatred, a slavery mindset, because look at what we're doing to the world. We destroy the world, we're destroying the environment. We've gone in and destroyed pretty much every indigenous culture that we've come in contact with. We've tried to destroy their religion. So you have within Western society a bunch of people like myself and probably like you who don't like what they see and don't feel good about it. And so their only response is to throw away their experience and want to adopt somebody else's, which is fine. I have no problem with that, especially if you get permission. All of the practices I've done, I went and I got permission from elders in that. I didn't just, walk around and start trying to pretend I was something I wasn't. But I don't know that we're ever going to really solve the racial problem until white people can be educated on the racism that they experienced, on the slavery and the Holocausts that they experienced. Otherwise, what ends up happening is that just like when somebody's abused, like when a child is abused, they end up becoming an abuser. So the same thing with societies. If a society as a whole is abused, then they end up taking on the role of their abuser, just like the Goths did when they invaded Rome looking for food, and Rome by then had completely destroyed itself. They went in and they occupied Rome, and then what did they do? They dressed like Romans, they talked like Romans, and they took on the Roman Christian religion. And then you've got the Spaniards and you've got the Anglo-Saxons who end up going and colonizing the rest of the world and doing exactly to the indigenous people, wherever they went, what was done to them and their ancestors. This is the result of abuse that has not been acknowledged. When trauma is not acknowledged, you end up becoming it. So that's one of the messages of this book. All right, so let's keep going. So here's another one, another instance. The massacre of the Saxon pagans. In 782, the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne was responsible for the Verdun massacre. In case you're not familiar with it, you can go look it up. Verdun massacre. By the way, I don't know who's on here. Bear in mind, this is a question and answer. I've seen a couple of people on here, and I'm seeing things. Just bear in mind, this is a question and answer. If you have questions, honest questions, I'm happy to look at them. Bear in mind, if you drop an opinion on me, you might be setting me up to come after you. Okay, so the best way to interact with me is to ask an honest question. Let me refresh the page here. It says there's only one person watching, which I know is not true. Hang on one second. 14 people. All right, let's keep going. All right, so Charlemagne was responsible for the Verdun massacre, where 4,500 indigenous pagan Saxon chieftains were lured into a trap and executed. Charlemagne was having difficulty conquering the last indigenous Germanic pagans and converting them to Christianity. The Saxon pagan tribes on the outskirts of Charlemagne's territory repeatedly rebelled against his authority simply because they were not willing to convert to Christianity. They were willing to ally themselves to Charlemagne, they just didn't want to abandon their ancestral faith. Charlemagne demanded that all of his subjects become Christians. The Saxon tribes refused. So Charlemagne simply slaughtered them all. He invited 4,500 Saxon chieftains to a peace meeting. Ancestral Saxon tradition prohibited warriors from bringing weapons to peace meetings. In tribal Saxon tradition, it was unthinkable for anyone to commit acts of violence at peace meetings. Such an act would be considered the epitome of cowardice by a Saxon warrior. The Saxon warrior code demanded truth in deed and word. Charlemagne, himself a descendant of the Germanic Frankish tribes, knew this. So when the chieftains and their attendants arrived to the peace meeting, Charlemagne's army, who were fully armed, surrounded them, forced them to convert to Christianity, and then executed all of them. Sound familiar? Is it any wonder where European Americans learned how to break peace treaties and impose their religion onto others? These are just three brief examples in a long history where the Roman imperial mindset was responsible for the destruction of the animist way of life in Europe. Roman legacy in Europe. Beginning in 58 BC, the Roman Empire began a campaign of military conquest, cultural genocide, racism, slavery, and oppression in Europe that officially lasted for over 450 years until Rome was sacked by the Germanic barbarian tribes. But even though the Roman Empire began its official demise in 410 AD, the spiritual genocide continued at the hands of the institutionalized Christian church up until the present time. Romans, even before the arrival of Christianity, branded all non-Romans, especially animists, as being inferior, primitive, and superstitious. The word pagan is a Roman word that translates into the modern word as ignorant, uneducated, superstitious redneck. So New Age people who want to say, oh, I'm a pagan, meaning that they're polytheists, because that's what they're trying to say. You're actually using the word that the Romans used against people who were animists who practiced their indigenous spiritual practices. Calling them pagans was basically calling them, an idiot redneck, because pagan means countryside. So the people who lived in the countryside were uneducated, they were farmers, and so the Romans who lived in the city, or those who lived in cities, saw themselves as educated, and so Christianity became the elite. I'm part of the elite. That's why I'm a Christian, and you're still worshiping, whatever, Mother Earth and Father Sky. You're such a pagan. So I find that interesting that even today people use that word, thinking they're rebelling against, Christianity. As has happened in more recent history with cultures that have been absorbed by modern European Christian countries, the indigenous European tribal cultures that were conquered or absorbed by the Roman civilization were taught to despise their pre-Roman barbarian animist culture and beliefs. So before I go any further, one of the things that I discovered in the 80s when I started looking into other kinds of spirituality, when I walked away from Christianity, I was of the belief that I was of Celtic origin, so I started looking into Neo-Druidism. And I found that Neo-Druids liked to read the Arthurian romances. So, Arthur and, Excalibur and Merlin the Magician and all that kind of stuff. And I think they still do. They kind of use that sort of as their Bible. But for me, this sort of typifies this, because even Saxon, even English people, people of English descent, they will see themselves when they want to think about their ancient religion. A lot of people will start talking about Arthur and Merlin and these kinds of things. But what that really shows is an unconscious self-hatred of their own Germanic heritage, which is still, which we still have running around in our society today. And that is shown because instead of wanting to worship Odin or Freya or Thor or Thunar or gods like that, which the Saxons worshipped, instead they want to worship. They want to read the Arthurian traditions, and they want to see themselves descended from Arthur. Now, that whole Arthurian tradition is completely fictionalized. None of it ever happened. It was written in France by people who were, it would be like reading the Arthurian romances back then would have been like people watching Dances with Wolves. It's a way for, people going and watching Dances with Wolves and thinking, oh yeah, those Native Americans, and they were so great, and all that, but it's still this unconscious racism against Native Americans. If you've ever watched that movie, Dances with Wolves is one of the most racist movies I've ever seen. And when you're watching it, you don't realize it, but when you think about it afterwards, the white guy has to come in and teach the natives how to use guns. He's going to protect them from the evil, bad white guys. He's not like those other white guys, and so he still gets to be the hero. So the white guy still gets to be the hero, but he's doing it in this really condescending sort of way, when if you're not realizing it, what you're doing is you're projecting onto them. You're just like saying, I'm not one of those bad people. But it's very racist. And the Arthurian romances were the same. There were a bunch of French people in France thinking about that kind of a thing. So they came up with this Arthurian legend of this pseudo-Christian, pseudo-Druid Celtic guy who was fighting the Saxons and all that kind of stuff. But it's complete fiction, all of it. And so even people who are of English Anglo-Saxon descent in Britain, a lot of them knee-jerk. If you say, what about the ancient religion of your people? They'll go, oh yeah, Arthur. but it represents a denial of one's own ancestral connection to the land, their ancestral connection to their indigenous, shamanic, animist past. And this is a holdover. This again is another example that to me shows us that we as a society 2,000 years later still have not dealt with the slavery mindset that we inherited from the Romans. Does that make sense? All right. So let's keep going here. Even though classical Rome was not able to conquer any territory north of France and Britain, eventually all of Europe adopted the Roman cultural and religious way of life. Even after the fall of the Roman Empire, animist Europeans were routinely slaughtered in the thousands by successive invading armies of the Holy Roman Christian emperors. The last practitioners of indigenous European spirituality lived in Western Lithuania. They were forcibly converted to Christianity in 1413. But indigenous European animism died hard. The Christian church and the monarchs that were supported by it continued to aggressively seek the complete eradication of animism from the European psyche. The continued spiritual destruction of the indigenous European animist mindset is most well known by the brutality of the Catholic Inquisition, and in more recent times, the European and colonial American witch trials of the 17th century. So what we see now that has happened to Native Americans in recent history also happened to indigenous European animists. We have simply forgotten about it. Our ancestors ingested this disease of self-hatred and continued to spread it to others. There's a saying in 12-step recovery circles which says, quote, hurt people hurt people. This means that those who have been abused will often abuse others in similar fashion. This does not excuse anyone, but it does explain it. Since Western society is still infected to a large degree with this spiritual disease of spiritual and ancestral self-hatred, the only lasting answer is to admit and address this issue. Since both European Americans and Native Americans are connected to each other in the effects of this spiritual disease, I believe that it is beneficial for both sides to examine all aspects of our shared history. While we can choose to isolate and lick our own wounds, it is my hope that we can engage in dialogue about these issues together and seek mutual healing as fellow animists. Having said that, we must each be responsible for our own spiritual recovery. For Westerners, this means that we need to seek out our own cultural and spiritual healing first. On a spiritual level, this means that we Westerners must seek out our own ancestors for healing and, yes, even forgiveness. My experience in my personal ritual work leads me to believe that our tribal European ancestors are deeply hurt by our abandonment of them and their wisdom. I have also experienced that they are very eager to teach us their knowledge, but we must ask them for it. They will not impose it on us. As I just said that, when I said our tribal European ancestors are deeply hurt by our abandonment of them and their wisdom, I felt a deep sadness. I wasn't conscious of it, it just overwhelmed me. So when that kind of stuff happens, that tells me that somebody's trying to tell me something. So one of the reasons it's important to do ritual of any kind, I don't care what kind it is, as long as it's something that you learned, that you learned from a specific tradition, or that if it was intuited, that it was honestly given to you by somebody. As long as that whenever we do that, we actually heal our ancestors that were abandoned. And I've shared the story before. I shared it last time I did this, but I'll share it again. I remember reading a historical account of some guy in Sweden way back around this time. And he was an elder, and he was an elite. He was an earl, and he had this estate that had, ancestral ritual land on it. I believe there were standing stones. I could be wrong about that, but there were sacred trees around the property. But because Christianity was taking over, the only way for him to do business and make money was to officially convert to Christianity. So the Catholic priest comes over and he brings the thing with the holy water, and he does what Catholic priests do, and he drives out the demons of the pagan religion. And so he goes around and he's using the little thing, and he's throwing the the holy water on all the sacred trees and the sacred stones and all of that, and he's, casting out the demons. And the guy, the Earl is like not thinking anything of it. He's just doing what he has to do to make a living. And that night he goes to bed and he has a dream where his grandfather and his father come to him and say, "What the hell are you doing? Why are you driving us away? We're here to help you." And that we caused a lot of harm when we separate the energetic connection between us and our ancestors. It causes them pain, and of course it causes us pain. And it was, really important for people to have this power of the ancestors with them. My ancestors called it hamingja, which is translated as luck, but it's not luck. It's an actual power of their presence. You experience it that you have all this luck in your life, but you don't realize that it's your ancestors that are working behind the scenes to help you continue on your path and your legacy. And the more that you continue your spiritual path and give it to your kids and to other people, the more that you have of the blessing of the ancestors who work to make sure that your life goes smoothly. We feel it's luck, but it's actually the ancestors working for us. So people didn't realize it, but when they went to church, if they were, whatever their indigenous religion was, and they go to church and get baptized, they don't realize that they're telling their ancestors, go fuck yourselves. Stay away from us. And they're cutting themselves off. And so, that's one of the reasons why even today Westerners have this feeling of isolation, this feeling that they're not connected to anything. They don't believe in anything. Why moderners want to escape. They want to escape the matrix. Always seeking to escape their feelings instead of feeling connected to, trusting the universe, trusting all the energies around you, right? That's what our ancestors did. Anyway, let's keep going. Many of our animist ancestors suffered through intense hardship as they were forced through violence to renounce their animist beliefs. So there is still much healing that needs to take place in the ancestral realm. It is my sense that some of our ancestors are confused and even lost. By reawakening our ancestral practices, they can find their way in the spirit realm. It is my belief that much of our current difficulties, economic, social, and environmental, can be alleviated by sending healing to our ancestors on the spiritual plane. Perpetuating spiritual confusion. By seeking to escape into Native American cultures, again, what I'm talking about, this is 10 years ago, and I'm over here in Australia. Well, I guess people in Australia do it too, now that I think about it. In fact, I've been to some sort of new agey kinds of things where you've got Australian, white Australians who are working with Native American, cards and Native American this, and they'll talk about, the Lakota, or they'll throw out some Native American tribe words, and they don't realize, I don't have the heart to say anything because they're just doing the best that they can, but they don't realize how offensive what they're doing is to Native Americans, and how, just that they don't realize, that they can pick up their own, Norse mythology. They can pick up Norse mythology. They can understand their own ethnic connection, if that's what they choose to do. By seeking to escape into Native American cultures without having addressed our own ancestral guides, we perpetuate the separation of ourselves from our ancestors. This does not mean that we cannot practice spirituality from other cultures. It simply means that if we are not able to accept ourselves for who we are, regardless of ethnic origins, we will never be truly whole on a spiritual level. In such cases, if we do not address our own ethnic spiritual tragedies, it will not matter which spirituality we adopt, there will still be an emptiness that will bring a superficiality to whatever we practice. This is another aspect why Native Americans take such deep offense at plastic shamanism, because they are able to profoundly sense the superficiality in the appropriated versions of plastic shamanism. If those of us of European descent can accept that we are naturally and instinctually animist just like everyone else, then we will no longer feel the need to adopt the culture of others in an attempt to absorb their animist beliefs. I believe if we can accomplish this, we can heal the misunderstandings of our Native American cousins and gain what we initially wanted, which is to find common ground between us all within animism in general. The noble savage. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's a term around the colonization of the New World. There was this move of the noble savage, this movement in Europe. And what it was is that people were coming back from the Americas with these stories of the indigenous people there, and they were talking about the noble savage. You know, they were talking about how noble it was that they walked around naked and that they, you know, they had these cute things and they did this and they worshiped the sky and the earth and how cute that was. And so it was, again, it was sort of like watching Dances with Wolves. It was like they're looking at it going, oh, how cute. But in reality, they have no problem stealing their land and, you know, enslaving them. They just think it's really cute that they do that. So it was called the noble savage. I believe much of the allure of the so-called Native American shamanism is the stereotype of the primitive skin-clad noble savage. Who doesn't like this idea? In all seriousness, I'm not criticizing this. I'm very attracted to the concept of the freedom associated with this stereotype. But why do we assume that it is not part of our heritage? Why, when we want to embody this principle, do we automatically assume that in order to access this, we must dress in Native American regalia? In modern society, when we think of the stereotype of the civilized person who is disconnected with nature, what comes to mind? Someone of European descent, right? More often, this stereotype is associated with the American of Anglo-Saxon descent. The irony here is that the pre-Roman Germanic tribes, from whom many Americans are descended, were stereotyped by civilized Romans as the extreme example of the noble savage during the Roman Empire. So the same is true when Tacitus and Caesar was going off into Britain or going into Germania. They would come back with these stories of these noble Germanic warriors, you know, and they would talk about how primitive they were and how they worshipped the sky and they worshipped, you know, this and how noble it was of them. And they, you know, even as they're conquering them, they would talk about, you know, all these big, stout Germanic, you know, tribal warriors with their blonde hair and their blue eyes, and as they're, you know, enslaving them. And anyway, let's continue because I talk about that a little bit. When first encountered by the Romans, the Germanic tribes did not use money. They had no concept of money. They only bartered real goods with each other. Wealth was only reflected in cattle. Our English word fee comes from the Germanic word for cattle, fehu. Even nowadays, when we receive payment for a service, a fee, we still use this same word for cow. So I charge a fee for all of my services. Fee means cow. It doesn't mean money. So I technically am charging a cow every time I do a Vedic reading. Caesar and Tacitus report that Germanic tribes wore mainly animal skins and bathed every morning in streams and rivers. They rode their horses bareback. They preferred to hunt and fish as opposed to farming. They had no cities. They lived in natural settings. They were utterly free of routine and simply did whatever they wanted. They were deeply spiritual people who received spiritual messages from horses. That's actually true. They listened to the call of birds for omens. They heavily practiced divination, which is where we get the runes from. Even Tacitus talks about, you know, the rune readings that they did. He didn't understand what it was, but looking back on it now, they were doing runes. They were working with runes. Almost anything that we associate with the stereotypical Native American medicine man was how the Romans perceived the Germanic tribes 2,000 years ago. Germanic people were extremely friendly to travelers and visitors. Anyone seeking food or shelter was warmly welcomed and fed. It was considered extremely rude to refuse a request from anyone. They were proud that in their territories, the Germanic tribes had hundreds of miles of pristine wilderness on their borders. They were fierce warriors who lived by a code of honor. They believed that their spirit was connected to their words. the worst thing an indigenous Germanic warrior could possibly do was to tell a lie. To do so would negate their own existence. A Germanic tribal warrior would die before he broke his oath. You know, you hear the term white man speak with forked tongue, right? You've heard that? The idea of telling a lie, according to many Native Americans, was unthinkable, because for them, their breath was connected to their speech. So their spirit, their soul, whenever you spoke something, your soul came out of your mouth through the air that you breathe. To use the air in your lungs, your spirit, to voice an untruth would be to deny your own existence. So it wouldn't even be, the fact that somebody would come to you and make a promise to you knowing that they were going to do something else, to them was, why would you do that? You will stop existing if you do that. So we've talked about that, you know, in American culture for a long time, but that's exactly how our indigenous tribal European ancestors lived as well. Same idea. It was no different. When traveling through sacred woods, this is an interesting one because, you know, what's happening now, you're seeing a lot of destruction of native forests because of fires in the U.S. and here last year. And you know, if you've noticed all of the forests that are just being cut down in the Amazon and in, you know, other parts of the world, including, you know, the United States, you know, we just don't think twice about it. We just look at it as their, you know, it's crops, it's there for us. Let's just chop it down, just without any concept of the environment or the animals or anything else. But in 2,000 years ago in Europe, when traveling through sacred woods, one was expected to be completely silent. If someone fell down while traveling through a sacred grove or forest, they were required to crawl the rest of the way out in order to not disturb the nature spirits that lived there. When visiting dignitaries from civilized countries would offer the Germanic tribal people gifts of money, they would prefer silver to gold because silver was shinier. They had no concept of the worth of coin money. When given silver goblets, it is recorded that the Germanic tribes preferred to drink from their wooden goblets instead. They were reported to be innocent and without guile. Tacitus and Caesar both report that the Germanic tribes did not own anything, including land. They had no slaves. They had no kings. Chiefs were not despots. All decisions were made through community voting. Roman women, in order to look more attractive to the Roman men, would bleach their hair blonde in order to look like the sexy, exotic Germanic slave girl. So one of the things I notice here is that people want to, I keep forgetting what that's called, you know, where you put your hair in dreadlocks. It's a big thing. I don't know, maybe it's a big thing everywhere, but it's a big thing here. But in order to take, if you've got straight hair, in order to take your straight hair and make dreadlocks out of it, you have to do all kinds of really artificial things. It's a lot of work and it's damaging to your hair. But the whole idea of that is to look more natural and authentic and all that, and it goes against the whole idea. Well, the same thing, the Romans did the same thing. Their women would bleach their hair blonde so that they could look like the sexy Germanic slave girl. You know, and whenever I see that, when I see these, you know, white people here in Australia who are walking around with dreadlocks, I know it's the style and I know they think it's cool and they're, you know, being more hippie and all that. But my thought is, you know, I see somebody who hates themselves. Why not be your natural self? You want to be natural? Let your hair be its natural thing. Anyway, people can do whatever the hell they want. But I see that. It reminds me of the Roman, you know, elite woman who's bleaching their hair blonde so they can look like the exotic, primitive Germanic slave girl, which of course now is the opposite. You know, you see a blonde-haired, blue-eyed person, they represent the elite of society. How things have completely flipped over the past 2,000 years. I find it very ironic. I could go on and on and on about how native Europeans were similar to how we view native indigenous people today, but you get the point. If we read Tacitus's Germania and substitute German with Native American or whatever ethnicity reminds you of the stereotypical noble savage, the results are identical. So if what we want is to reconnect the tribal shaman, all we need to do is look to our own ancestors and emulate them. All right, I'm going to stop there because then we're going to go on to some other stuff. Anyway, I don't know why I'm so self-conscious today. I feel like I'm really worried people are going to judge me for what I'm saying today. I don't know where that's coming from. Anyway, I'm happy to take questions of any sort, whatever they are. We can go on with that. Black Earth Productions says he's there listening. He puts kind of a funny joke there. He says Norse lives matter. Ha ha ha. That's very true. But that was true 2,000 years ago. Anyway, do I want to talk about that? Let's just see what any questions there are. Let me look at any questions and then I'll see if I want to respond to that. I don't know what this has to do with anything. Again, the best thing to do is ask me an honest question. Whenever you just drop an opinion, without context or, trying to whatever, you set yourself up. So if you're new to the channel, that's one thing you should know. If you want to ask a question, you can write the word question and I'll be happy to answer it. Norval Cooksey says, don't forget, we only stopped eating human meat about 500 years ago. Who the hell are you talking about? I don't understand. Who the hell are you talking about? And what does that have to do with this? Are you trying to say that it's our natural thing to be cannibals? I'm not so sure I agree with you. I don't know where you're getting that from. Kelly Hoskins asked, how do you ask the elder? Well, which elder are you talking about? I want to know, do you have an elder in mind that you want to talk to? If you have a question for me, the good thing to do is write out the whole question. Put it in context so I know what you're asking me. You obviously have a question, so give your question the respect it deserves. Ask all of it in context so I can best answer you. I don't know what you mean by how do you ask the elder. I don't know what elder you're talking about. Are you talking about the ancestors? Do you mean how do you ask the ancestors? It's simple. You just ask them. Just go anywhere where you feel connected. If you want to go outside, if you want to put on some music and close your eyes, anything that makes you feel connected, and then ask your ancestors. How can I connect to a good question to ask is how can I connect to whatever spirituality is going to help me be my best self? And then, watch and see what happens. It's kind of interesting that you ask that question. How do you ask them? Right? Because if you want to ask, how do you ask your next door neighbor for a cup of sugar, you just go over and knock on the door and ask them. But the fact that we don't know, that we're so disconnected to not even understand that they're here with us. And all we have to do is just simply send out a desire to connect, and they'll connect with us. That's kind of sad. I understand it, but it's kind of sad. Our ancestors you wouldn't have even have to ask that question. How do you ask the ancestors? There wouldn't have been any need for that. People would know. Of course, they had things like the standing stones of. There's standing stones all over Europe, but the standing stones in Stonehenge, for the longest time, people didn't know what those stones were, what they meant. And so anthropologists would wonder, what are these stones? What are they for? And there was an anthropologist who was working with an anthropologist from, I can't remember exactly where it was. I can't remember if it was Bali or someplace like that. But someplace that still had a recent connection to its ancestral heritage. And they were there, and they were both, working there. And the European guy asks, I still wonder what the purpose of the stones were. And the Bali guy looked at him and said, really? You don't know? He goes, yeah, I don't know. He says, it's really simple. That's the ancestors. And since they've done excavations on the big stones there in Stonehenge, guess what's buried underneath the stones? People's bones. So they take the bones of the elders and they put stones on them. Yeah. So, in other words, we're so disconnected and so removed from all of this that things that are obvious to everybody else we miss. Even questions like, how do you connect with the ancestors? Just talk to them, just like you would anybody else. Gowrie asks, can I ask my question here? Yes. Do me a favor, write the word question and ask away. As long as it's honest, and write a whole sentence. Don't just throw a few words in there. Actually ask a question with the intent to have me understand it so that I can answer it. CRA question, on my last journey, or you mean your last shamanic journey? I was attempting to connect with my ancestors and I became overly frightened and abruptly left the session. How do I apologize for being so rude to the spirits? Again, how do you apologize for being rude to your next door neighbor? You go over and you knock on the door and you say, hey, I'm really sorry. I was rude to you the other day. How hard does that have to be? I'm really interested to know why it was so frightening for you. But, I mean, it's okay to be afraid. I'm not going to judge you for being afraid. I don't think they're going to judge you for being afraid either. Why not go and, instead of, apologizing, you can if you want, why not go and say, I'm afraid. Can you help me? Why am I so afraid? And maybe they'll help you with that. Okay, I don't see any more questions here. So, you know the deal. If you're not asking me questions, then I got to sell you on stuff. So, we have a couple of things I want to share with you before we go any further. Before we go any further here, let's see. What did I want to put up here? I wanted to put up, where is it? Yearly subscriptions. Okay, so here's something that has just started on Patreon. So by the way, if you want to support this channel, you want to support what I'm doing, there's many ways to do it, but one of the ways is to go up here to thunderwizard.com. You can see the 90-day challenge, thunderwizard.com. You can go there and subscribe at whatever level you want. At the beginning level, you get to learn mastery of shamanism courses, where I teach you from A to Z, from the beginning to end. I created that. The reason why I started that whole thing was because people were asking me, I don't know where to start. Can you give me a step-by-step instruction manual? So I went, and I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of hours of videos there are, but they're in just the entry-level subscription. You get access to that, and it will take you months, if not years, to get through all of those exercises that are in there. And there's the Manifestation Mastery course, which is another level. There's the 90-day challenge, where you actually get to work with me. You get to do the rituals and exercises with me. And anyway, if you decide you want to subscribe, check it out. You can subscribe now and get for 2 months off. You can subscribe for a year. So this is something new that Patreon is doing. Now you can subscribe for a year. When you do, I will give you 2 months off. And even then, if you subscribe for a year and you decide you don't like it, you can still cancel your subscription and get whatever money that's there back. So you got nothing to lose. Subscribe, and then you can check it out. And if you like it, stay for as long as you want. And when you're bored, you can unsubscribe. Not a big deal. And then we have this 90-day path, which I've talked to you about already, which 90-day challenge, which I'm going to upload some more. I've got the morning practice, and I've got the midday practice, and then I'm going to be working on the evening practice, and I'm going to upload that fairly soon also. All right. Ceremonial witchcraft. Question. When baptized and we disconnect from our ancestors being a symbolic sacrament, do we use symbolism during ritual to reconnect to our ancestors? Well, you deleted a comment there, which I completely agree with, ceremonial witchcraft, which is that ceremony and ritual stimulates the unconscious mind. Our ancestors used ritual um, because they understood that our unconscious mind creates everything. So your unconscious mind literally creates your reality. So the beliefs that you hold, not consciously but unconsciously, the programs. This is why my experience of Christianity is so destructive, because even though you've got all these things in there to make you feel good, like Jesus saving you and Jesus dying on the cross and Mother Mary, you've got all these things, and God is love, and if love your neighbor as yourself, and all these really great teachings. The underlying assumption is that human beings are pieces of garbage that are born in sin and that are worthy of destruction. That is something that gets put into you. You get branded with that, and it gets into your unconscious from the moment that you're born. And the whole baptism is about being washed away of what? Your identity, because you are sinful. You are born evil and separated from God. And so you have to be washed away of your sins. Even how beautiful, I got baptized. I remember getting baptized as a kid. It was I had this I remember the feelings that I had, and it was really wonderful. Except that in order to be baptized, you have to first believe that you are worthless and that you are deserving of destruction and hell. And you're being reborn, meaning that you want to get rid of who you were born to be. It's all about denying your essence because of the person who created you, for some reason, didn't have the ability to create you perfectly exactly the way you were. So, Christianity has ritual as well, which works with the unconscious in order to deny your connection to yourself. So, can you use symbolism to reconnect to your ancestors? Absolutely. People still do it. You go to graveyards and they bring a drink and they pour a drink on the ground. One for you, one for me. All that stuff works. But lighting candles to the ancestors works. Lighting a fire to the ancestors works. There's a reason why we put I'm just sitting here thinking about. I'm looking at a picture of my fiance who passed away. I keep the coffee cup of her picture there, with me all the time. That's a symbolic gesture to the ancestors. When you put the picture of your grandparents on your fireplace, that is a symbolic ritual thing to do, because the fireplace was originally called the Ingle Nook, the Nook of Ing. Ing is the god of the ancestral fire. And he's one of the runes as well. And it's the same god in the Vedic tradition called Agni, which is the god of sacred fire that burns away the offerings to the ancestors and creates the smoke that goes to the heavens. So of course, every sacrament, every symbol, every ritual that you do is something that can be used to connect to the ancestors. And it connects you on an unconscious level. Your unconscious mind, when it comes to ritual, is far more important than your conscious mind. Okay, did I answer your question? All right, I don't see any more questions here, so I'm prepared to say goodbye for the day. So that's it. So do me a favor, if you are interested in all of my books and everything that I was reading from today, you can go to courses.thunderwizard.com. Of course, subscribe and hit the bell button. If you subscribe and hit the bell button, you will achieve enlightenment, guaranteed. And the 90-day challenge, I recommend that you go check that out. That's it. All right. Hope you guys are doing well, and I'll talk to you all very soon.